Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for the August Successful Gardener class. I just said we're recording. We are. That's in my notes. My name is Christine with the Union of Mr. Gardeners, and we host this Successful Gardener series the first Thursday of every month except December at 7 o'clock. And we record the talk and we post it on our YouTube channel. So you can watch it whenever, especially because I've already seen some previews of this one. There's going to be lots of things that you're going to want to take notes about. So, just know that it'll be posted probably within the next 7 days. And so you can go out and pull some of that stuff out for yourself. Next month, we will have Abby Artemisia. Isn't that a cool name? She's with the Wander School, which she founded, and she's going to talk to us about herbs, about growing, using, preserving them, everything about herbs. So you can find more about her at the Wander School, and I will put that in the chat box, that link, wanderschool.com. Make sure to register at our website, Master Gardeners Union County NC.org, and I'll just put the link in the chat box. And if you want the full calendar, I'll also put that link in the chat box, but it is the Successful Gardener calendar. You can see the rest of the year. And pretty soon, in the next couple of months, we'll start posting for 2023, actually. I'll add all of those links to the chat box. And we're going to have some other links that I'm going to add that Todd has in his presentation. And I'll just go ahead and add those for you all as well. Our website has a lot of information. I mean, like a lot of information. You could probably spend hours out there. And so by all means, run out there and click some buttons and see what you find. But there's all kinds of interesting information there for people who've just moved to the county or to the area. So some plants that you just can't go wrong with, those kind of things. So if you're just starting out with some of that new soil and a new subdivision kind of thing, or even a new house, new to you. But also some information about about things like native plants and pollinator plants, which sometimes are the same thing. Vegetables, shrubs, trees, whatever, all kinds of things out there. And you can also see some of the community projects that we're working on. Also, if you're interested in becoming a master gardener, it's actually a lot easier than you might imagine. And it's also, you don't have to know anything about plants to become a master gardener. You will learn about them through the training, and you can find out more about that on our website too, and I will post that link as well. Tonight, we have Todd Jackson, who is with Roots Farm in the Waxhaw Marvin area. There he is. He's waving to you all. And I think he's frozen, or I'm frozen. Who's frozen? I'm going to wait a minute. Are we back now? Sorry about that, guys. It's going to be one of those nights with connectivity, probably. But Todd Jackson is he's with Roots Farm in Waxhaw Marvin area, and he's going to talk to us about starting our fall garden. Todd is a native of the area and grew up in North Mecklenburg County. He attended Queen's University and has been gardening for the last 15 years. And 4 of those years, he has been the farm manager at Roots Farm. And he's going to discuss specifics about growing in our grow zone, trends in the weather, and how to prepare for the future, really. And when you build a garden, you really do need to think about how things are going to be in a year or 2 or 10 or whatever. And how to prepare and maintain your fall garden, and not just the annuals that are your vegetable, your edibles, but also perennials. We'll talk about those too. And we'll also talk about some of the best crops for the fall, because you can't grow everything all the time. There are certain things that grow really well here during the fall and other things that do not. I'll ask you to add your questions to the chat box, and we'll fill those toward the end of the hour. And again, this is recorded and it'll be on our YouTube channel. And I will make sure that that's posted on Facebook, or you can just find it on our website. It'll be easy to find. So Todd, talk to us about growing things in cooler weather. We're all anxious to hear about that.
Excellent. Well, without any further ado, I think we'll jump right in and kind of recap the larger points of what we'll cover this evening. First thing, I like to make sure that everyone's kind of brought up to speed on what zone we're in, but not just that, but like specific climate factors that exist in the North Carolina Piedmont. And then we'll dive pretty deep into understanding edible gardens in the fall, how to properly plan for those, what time of year you should be looking at, what plants do well, and then branch from that base of knowledge to look at caring for perennials, possibility of using cover crops, deciding if that's a good fit for you, and if it is, how best to track that. And we'll then cover a couple other additional notes just to help you be successful. We live right on the border of zone 7B and 8A. For us, that means that during the typical calendar year, we can expect up to about 200 frost-free days, which is better than average across most of the country, but it's important to we'll get into what that looks like on your transition from summer to fall to make sure you have time for your vegetable selections to really get to their healthy size. Other key things about our specific county, we get a little more than the average rainfall across the U.S. We get about 45 inches on the average year. We do have droughts from time to time, but it's worth noting as well that we get more sunny days than most of the country. What that can tell us about our weather patterns is we typically have bright, sunny summers, but we also, when we get rain, we tend to get a lot of rain at one time. That's worth noting, especially for our clay soils, which don't do the best job, especially those that have been compacted or worked or turned in various ways through construction at allowing moisture to properly drain into the soil. Take note of this when you're building your garden to make sure that you allow spaces for excess water to move around your beds and ensure that there's not standing water in your beds. Additionally, looking at our average temps in this area, we have some hot weather in Union County, especially during the summer. We right now have about a month that are going to sit above 95 degrees, and that's not to include the effect of humidity on the real field temperature. But we could see temperatures breaking 90 as early as April and right the way up to Halloween. So definitely take that into account for planting, but also for whether you want to be spending a certain amount of time in your garden during the length of our season. And additionally, our winters are fairly mild. Sometimes we will have snow, but not every year. And typically, even on our coldest days, at some point we will break freezing. So we don't have to take quite the same measures as gardeners towards the mountains or further north in Virginia and Pennsylvania. Applying that, one of the main things that I want to sort of transfer to everyone this evening is understanding the main difference between planting in the spring and the fall, because a lot of your crops will be similar or can be. Broccoli, cabbage, your leafy greens like spinach and lettuce, your root crops like your carrots and your radishes, they all do well in both of our shoulder seasons, but the things to be aware of are different. If we look at sort of a chart of how our calendar year matches up to day length, we had pretty solid growing sunlight hours by the time we're at the beginning of March, certainly by the middle of March. But in our region, we can't really rely on being past our possibility of a strong frost until the middle of April. So what that tells us is we can plant that early, but we have to be taking measures in order to protect our crops, especially our young seedlings, our transplants that are more sensitive. But if we look at the fall, our sunlight hours have drifted right down towards close to 10.5 hours a day, quite slow growing in our region by the time the temperatures actually dip low enough to threaten anything to do with frost damage on our cool evenings. The important thing there is that when we're looking at the right time to plant for the fall, a lot of us will default to waiting until the weather cools down, kind of relying on the temperature to tell us when to plant the garden, and the same that we do for the spring. The issue is that starting in August and right the way through September, we're losing about 15 minutes of daylight every week. And not just losing that light, but the light that we're getting each successive week is less direct as the Earth continues its tilt away from the sun in the northern hemisphere. So the light that we're getting is less intense and is doing less to help our plants grow. So if we want to plant longer season fall crops, so your cabbages, your Brussels sprouts, it's really important to try to find the opportunity to get them in as early as possible in that end of July, beginning of August area, in order to give them the time they need to get to a mature state before we run out of usable daylight towards the end of October and beginning of November, when everything slows to a crawl. And then sort of building off of that, when you are planning for the fall garden, the biggest thing that's important to that planning is understanding the space that you have, the time that you have, and the other resources that are going to be the limiting, allowing your garden to be a success. One of the main things that happens with certainly a lot of new gardeners, or even just overzealous gardeners, is trying to get a little bit too much out of the garden bed, either overcrowding your bed, putting in plants that are young and stacking them too close together to allow them to get the proper size that they need, or allow the airflow that they need around them in order to stay healthy and help ward off diseases without the use of herbicides or fungicides. But the other thing is simply putting too much in the garden for you to reasonably take care of, to prune, to keep an eye on how insect pressure is going. My biggest recommendation remains to really understand what you have the room to do. And I encourage people all the time to grow less if that can help you grow those things better. You'll find across the board that a well-kept, clean garden is not only much more pleasant to be in, but is healthier and significantly more productive than 4 times the space that's just left to fend for itself. Looking specifically at a couple of the different broad types of crops here, sort of the average spacing that you can expect for leafy greens and root crops. That includes everything from arugula and spinach to carrots and beets. Some are going to require a little bit more room so they can swell. Some you can almost sow directly on top of each other. You will see that information on the back of your seed packets, or it can be easily researched if you're purchasing starter plants. But sort of like those spaces, it's important to understand if you have like a 4x8 raised bed, it's a common size. A lot of people get really excited to get their fall squash in. Maybe they want to get pumpkins, but for vine crops in particular, for small home gardens, it's really important to know if you have a compact or an open style vine crop, because your open vines will take over, they'll crawl past the bed, past the walkway onto the patio, and it'll be very difficult to maintain your space and be able to get in there, and as well as just keep the area healthy. Additionally, for those that want to really maximize their small space, we use a technique called intercropping. The key philosophy behind that is we take our long season crops and we sort of build around those, our larger crops that are going to be in for 10 or more weeks. For the fall, that could include our fall squashes, but a lot of times we start with our brassicas, so our cabbages and our cauliflower and our broccoli. We typically use a 3x3 square to grow in to give them plenty of room to spread out and form their heads. But when we plant them, they might be 6 inches across in any direction. And there's a lot of bare soil around there that's not really getting used. And we'll take advantage of that by choosing crops that have a much shorter maturity time. A lot of your salad radishes typically have a 4 to 5 week maturity period from seed to harvest. Some of your more mid-season larger root crops might include beets or turnips, and they might be closer to 7 to 8 weeks. And by putting these sort of in those middle areas between our larger crops, they'll have an opportunity to grow, mature, and be harvested before our cabbages and our broccoli is having a chance to overshadow them or overcrowd them. And we can end up essentially getting 2 or 3 crops out of the same space just by balancing our schedule and hitting our crop times right. It does require some planning on the front end. You can make it very simple and just sort of like plant your corners and allow things to grow out to them. You can make it as complex as you're willing to take on, but it's a great way to take a bed that might have only produced 8 heads of broccoli, and now you can have 8 heads of broccoli, a couple dozen turnips, and enough salad radishes to have for weeks, and as well as share with your neighbors. Speaking back a little bit to planting times in our chart, when deciding what to plant for the fall, it's also worth noting the when. A thing that a lot of gardeners, certainly novice gardeners, neglect when they are looking at their variety selection is to look at the dates to maturity, as well as the ideal germination temperature for their plants. Is understand like how many days you have left before we start to be concerned about losing our sunlight and the threat of frost. If you look at the dates to maturity, which are typically planted on seed packets, but are certainly easily researched for each variety, you definitely want to give yourself a week or two of leeway for any one thing that could cause your plants to begin to slow growing. And most seed packets will tell you what the germination temperature is, the temperature of your soil. For some of your cool season crops, I'm thinking particularly of spinach, arugula, and lettuce. They prefer cooler temperature soil to germinate well. So we're looking at somewhere in the low to mid 60s typically for those varieties. And if you were to plant them in, say, mid-August, when we're still having days that are 95 degrees out and that sun's beating down on the soil, those seeds may sit there for a while before they actually start to sprout and sort of throw off your schedule, or any number of things could happen in between where there may be uneven germination, or insects or rodents might go in and find your seeds and nibble on them, and you won't realize until things just don't start popping up. And vice versa, there are several crops that we normally attribute to our shoulder seasons. So like Swiss chard and kale, beets, that actually for germination temperatures that are fairly high, upper 70s and mid 80s, crops to start in mid to late August, and then allow to make the way through to the cooler temperatures. So looking into that information is definitely a worthwhile few minutes to spend while deciding what it is you'd like to grow this year. And to sort of help with that, we just did a quick list of a couple of crops that we started our farm at different points during the fall that we found a lot of success with in this region. for August. So right now through the next couple of weeks, fantastic time to start your fall squashes. You definitely don't want to wait much longer. Most of your fall squashes have maturity dates that push 100 days. So these are your butternuts, your acorns, your delicata, your pumpkins, all your brassicas. So your collard greens, your cabbages, your broccoli, your Brussels sprouts. This is the time to get them in the ground in the next 3 weeks or so in this region. Uh, Additionally, like we said, chards and beets. And then carrots. Carrots do actually have a preferred germination temperature, a little bit lower, usually in the mid 70s. But because most carrots, finger carrots excluded, are also pushing that 100-day mark, in order to make sure that you have more than just spindly roots coming into October, sometime in mid-August is usually the best time to look at planting your carrots for a late fall harvest. Waiting a little bit further, your lettuce starts to come in. If you want to do kale, September is also a good time for that. There's plenty of time to maturity and have, especially if you do multi-harvest, if you're just picking off the outer leaves, several harvests before the frost gets it, if it does it all in our region. Turnips, arugula, bok choy, all your Asian greens do really well in September. And then you can even plant right the way up to October, as our days are getting very short, with things like salad radishes, things that turn around, 4 or 5 weeks. You can squeeze them in. But it's also a great time to look at crops that you might want to consider trying to overwinter. Garlic is an excellent example of that. Most bulb crops are, where you can allow them to get started in those last few weeks of October, and then sort of give them that nice layer of mulch to insulate them from the frost in the winter. And then coming back to the spring, they'll have had their roots established. Their bulbs will be nice and filled by about May, and you'll have a great harvest that will be typically much larger and healthier than if you were to try to start the same crops in May and grow them through the heat of the summer. Speaking a little bit more towards variety selection, particularly if you're getting starter plants, or even if you're trying to start your own, understanding the difference between crops and varieties. Not every cabbage is the same. Not every broccoli is the same. And if they're not labeled, if it just says broccoli, you might want to ask some questions. There's significant differences in growth habits, in size, but most importantly for your planning purposes is days to maturity. Cabbage is a big one. Our miniature and our early varieties of cabbage can come out of the ground as quickly as 9 weeks from seed, but some of our late cabbages, I know a handful of greenhouses around the area that do a variety called late flat Dutch. Fantastic cabbage, absolutely huge when they're grown well. They can get up to about 12 pounds, but they're a 140-day crop. And 140 days from today is Thanksgiving. And that's a long time, especially as those days start to get shorter, and that 140 days gets stretched further and further, because a week in August, from as far as a photosynthesis and the sunlight you're getting, is not the same as a week in early November. It may be December before you get those crops, if you even get a full crop at all. Broccoli typically is a shorter season crop. There's less intensity in the decision of that, but it's definitely worth the research and worth the attention at planning stage. But that's not to say that Halloween is the last day you can be growing something in Union County. There's plenty of things you can do to buy yourself some extra time, allow even slow growing to continue well into the winter, and sometimes even right the way into the new year, with a couple relatively easy and scalable techniques. classic one is what's called a low tunnel. It's a simple hoop made sometimes with wire or metal conduit or just PVC pipes that holds up a sheet of plastic, and you essentially form a small greenhouse over your growing bed. And it allows you to kind of trap that radiant heat from the sun during the day and carry that through to the evening, and keeps that frost off a little bit. Usually you can buy 2 or 3 weeks, sometimes more, on your growing season and into the frost period. Another thing is what's called a floating row cover. It's a very lightweight fabric that's used. It can come in sizes anywhere from 5 foot by 5 foot to industrial rolls that are 20 feet wide by 1,000 feet long. But these are so that they can act on top of your crops without hoop support. Now, some crops are a little more sensitive to that, especially when they're small or when the fabric itself gets wet or can get whipped around by wind. So with how you use it, we typically always use it with just small wire hoops, just to give it something to rest on that's not the plants. And there's all manner of different weights is how the thickness of the fabric is measured. We find that the very lightweight fabric, so that can be down to about 1/4 ounce is what they call it, or other companies like Agribon is a big company that makes floating row covers. They'll measure it in grades, anywhere from HE15 to HE70. The very low fabric, it's so thin, it doesn't do a very good job of insulating, but also it's extremely brittle. It's almost like tissue paper. You can tear it. So we typically don't use anything that light. And then on the upper end, when you get into the 2 ounce or 2.5 ounce fabric, or the AG70s, for Agribon's measurement, it's almost like a blanket at that point. It blocks more than 50% of sunlight. It's heavy. If it gets wet, it's even heavier. Usually, we don't recommend that either, because the insulation value, you don't get as much at that point. You're only gaining maybe a degree or two over the lighter. So somewhere in that 1/2 ounce to 1 ounce range, for the AG30 to AG50, that's typically what we recommend if you would like to try floating row covers. And for those, and even for the low tunnels, you're really only getting your benefit from those in the evenings, or at least at the coldest part of the day, from say when the sun goes down till 8:30 to 9 in the morning, when the sun starts to warm things up again. So during the day, we recommend pulling the plastic back or pulling the row cover back to allow your plants to breathe, to get the full amount of sunlight that they can get, especially in those low sunlight periods of the year. And just to allow for, especially if it's a crop that has flowers at that point in the year, you're definitely going to want to let your any pollinators that are still around be able to get access to those. Or even we've had issues before where we've actually we've trapped some of our pest issues inside of our floating row covers. 2 years ago, we had a big issue with different caterpillars on our lettuces that we had underneath the row covers. And we were trying to keep them closed in order to get anything new from coming in, but we were just exacerbating the problem. So we just left it open one day, and within about an hour, there was an audible buzz, as we had about 20 wasps that had flocked to our bed, and they were all hunting the caterpillars that we had essentially been blocking them from getting to for about 3 weeks. So allowing sunlight and air to get to your plants even during the fall, or deep fall and winter, it's usually a good idea, just across the board. but just be mindful with your day temperatures, especially if you plan on growing deep into the winter. And then lastly, for those growing in containers, super simple to extend your season simply by paying attention to your evening temperatures or any frost warnings or expectations of snow or other winter type precipitation. When that stuff's coming, just take your plant, even if it's just in your garage, somewhere that's going to be a little bit warmer than your ambient temperatures, and then bring them back outside so they can enjoy as much sun as they can during the day. And you can typically grow right the way through the winter sometimes with different potted plants. Sort of transitioning now from the annual garden and looking specifically at some of your perennial plants. Now, there are some rules of thumb that will need to be applied to different types of plants. You don't treat a blueberry bush like you treat a peach tree, like you treat a muscadine vine, but there are there's common ground that is true in almost every case. And one of the primary ones is that the late fall and winter, as the plants go dormant for the season, excellent time to look at taking on pruning for those. The biggest goal of pruning is to help your plant continue to grow in a way that's going to be both productive, also healthy. It's a good time to remove damaged or diseased or spindly branches off of your plant so that those don't become important structural pieces of your plant that are less strong or sort of setting the plant up for failure because those are damaged or could potentially be an area where a disease could be either transferred to another plant or transferred to other areas of that plant. Typically, when we're looking at pruning, after we've dealt with the areas that are clearly damaged or otherwise ailing, the next most important thing is to look for areas where your branches are crossing and sort of like taking up the same space. When they have leaves on them, especially as they begin to grow and branch off of those leaves shade each other out and keep each other from being able to cleanly transfer moisture away from the plant during the heat of the season. You're welcoming in fungus in those situations, areas for a lot of your pest insects to hide and to nest away from their predators, particularly birds. So giving your interior of your plants a little bit of room to breathe and for air to go through by pruning those crossed branches is also a good idea. Looking at different types of plants, especially if this is a fruiting plant that you're trying to grow, or even if it's like a flowering plant as a part of your landscape, it's worth looking into your specific variety as to where are my flowers growing? Is it on the new growth for that season, or does my plant flower or fruit on the first year growth or the second year growth, or other older parts of the plant? For example, a lot of your muscadines and other grape varieties, almost all of their flower and then fruit production comes off of new growth from that season. And so cutting back, pruning for those is primarily looking towards trying to cut back and help establish and strengthen and help guide and direct your growth from the year before, your now woody growth, so that when all of your young growth comes off in the new year, it's coming in a manageable direction. It's the right amount of new growth, so you're not overdoing what your plant can handle nutritionally. But for blueberry, it's very different. It's not your new growth, it was your growth from the year before. So you're looking at your second through fourth year growth, typically. So younger systems are going to be where typically your flower buds are coming from, not your leaf buds. And so for those, ideally, you're looking at pruning back some of that growth that came from last year, so that you're focusing on healthy canes that are going to be growing up and producing enough fruit that you'll have a good harvest. Not so much that the plant can't handle it, and then when your new growth comes off again, that those are not crowding each other in the center of the um, and sort of like lastly on the perennials, uh, fall is a great time of the year to be looking at mulching your plants. One, your weed seeds are going to be less active germinating, but that new mulch is a great way to insulate the roots of some of your crops from the cold temperatures that can come in our region. We can dip down close to 10 degrees in the evenings. And while most plants that are sold here are hardy for this region, at least those sold from local suppliers, that's not universally the case, and you can still get a plant that's hardy through zone 6 or even 5 that can be damaged by extended exposure, especially young plants, to the roots with temperatures below 20 degrees. So definitely always recommend that you have something on the soil surface to keep it from being directly exposed to frost for your perennials. Uh, One last note on these. Something that I found that people are less familiar with is that peppers, so that's pretty much across the board, everything from bell peppers to your hot peppers like habaneros and cayennes. In their native range, these are perennial. We grow them in our region as annuals because they're not cold hardy. Not in our region. They typically stop right at around October as soon as we start having evenings dipping below 40. But especially if you have these either in a hoop house or in containers that you can bring inside and just keep sort of in a sunny room, they will go dormant during the winter. You'll want to trim off any fruits and flowers and sort of cut some of the smaller growth back to the thicker branches and woody parts. But as long as you keep it watered and having moderate sun exposure through the winter, it will come back in the spring strong, root base already established, and you'll find not only that you'll have peppers earlier in the year, but you'll have a lot more than you did the year before. We've had examples of cayenne plants that were 4 years old that were almost 5 foot tall, growing out of 30-gallon pots, and definitely a good way to sort of like maximize your potential harvest, especially if you're growing in limited spaces, as many people doing container gardening do, and worth experimenting with just to kind of learn a new technique on how you might be able to get the most out of your garden. Branching from that back to the annual garden, uh, talk about cover crops for a little bit. So I think a lot of people are intimidated by the idea of a cover crop, growing something in the garden that for a while looks like weeds just take over your space, and then trying to figure out how to grow back into that. Uh, I'd like to encourage people to sort of like take a different mindset with cover crops. These are intentionally selected crops that do a really good job of establishing themselves quickly and being relatively easy to deal with on the other side. The big goal for cover crop is suppressing weed growth by basically crowding them out and having a nice established stand. And in that as well, preventing erosion from both irrigation watering and just general like hard rainfalls. But really, at the end of the day, the big goal is to add fertility. not only by those crops that you're growing, sort of bringing up a lot of those minerals and nutrients from further down in the soil and putting them at the surface level, that growing practices or low till even. All of those root systems that are there, as those begin to like break down in your upper 6 to 8 inches of soil where they're really thick, they leave a lot of channels where your microbial growth, your helpful funguses, they live in that space. They're feeding on those things and leaving behind their castings, those nutrient-rich pieces. But even just allowing channels that allow for water to easily go down, especially again in sort of our clay soils, that sometimes that can be a problem, and sort of having that air and water exchange. It's like having your soil tilled as far as aeration without actually bringing that living piece. Um, there are dozens of varieties of common cover crops. Some do well in hot weather, some do well in cold weather, some cross over. There are companies that will sell mixes that are general purpose. It can be very easy to be intimidated by all of that. Before you even get to that, figure out which cover crop might be uh, situation to see if any makes sense. There are clear benefits to using cover crops, but like all crops, they take time to grow. They take time to go out and seed and water. And in order to integrate them back into your soil, typically you're looking at going back and mowing those and either tilling them directly back into the soil once they've been cut down, or if you're committing to the no-till concept, you'll have to allow time for those to break down naturally long enough for you to be able to go back through the sort of surface debris. That can be sped up by laying out a black tarp typically over that area and sort of like uh, really allowing mulch to break down faster as you trap the moisture and the heat under there. But you're looking typically at a minimum of 8, sometimes 10 weeks to allow cover crop to really do its job and get the benefits. And if you're trying to squeeze your summer and your fall crops in already, it may be worth considering whether or not a cover crop is a good fit versus a quality compost or a well-sourced organic fertilizer to fit your needs in the same space. Building off of those all ideas, a couple of just general notes for when you're looking at growing in the fall. Uh, if you are going from a summer garden and planting in the same space, uh, especially if you're growing your squashes, your cucumbers, your melons, or you're growing corn. Can we still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay,
You're back.
excellent. Um, In addition to making sure that your plants are well fed, transitioning out of that summer garden, you're going to end up typically with a good amount of just vegetable debris. dead or dying tomato plants, what's left of your squashes, so on. And not long in the future, you're going to be looking at your leaves beginning to fall. Those two together make an excellent compost pile. You get a nice, just sort of natural mix of nitrogen and carbon rich sources. And for that reason, particularly your August, September time is an excellent time to begin a small compost pile for your farm, a way to take uh, stuff that you might otherwise have to find a home for, or might end up trying to bag up and send off to a yard waste facility, and finding a way to make use of it on your property to help feed your vegetables come the spring and into the next season. Uh, as I mentioned before, our climate here is well suited to overwintering certain types of crops, particularly your bulbs, so your garlic and your onions and your other crops in that family. Just the big recommendation with those is, like the perennials, definitely consider having a mulch of some sort. That can be sort of that mulch that we all think of as just like finely ground wood chips, but straw does a great job, even just shredded leaves, just to help insulate them from those heavy frosts, because typically planting in September, October, you're still looking at younger plants, more shallow root systems. And if we get a night where that frost sort of penetrates into that upper level of soil, you can end up doing a lot of damage unintentionally. And then lastly, for those general notes, as you get towards the end of your season, late fall, you've been using your equipment all through the year, different tools. It's a good time to look at maintenance for those things. If you haven't been doing that actively through the season, for your tillers, looking at winterizing those that need it. And then also just taking a moment to compile notes, things that worked well during the year. Issues you may have had, different pests that were a problem, diseases, maybe things that you weren't able to identify but would like to follow up on so that they aren't a problem, or hopefully aren't a problem in future seasons. Definitely recommend taking notes and having those around so that the lessons learned from this year don't have to be learned over and over again. So one other thing, just as sort of a larger looking forward, because especially as we establish gardens and we sort of invest in our soil, we plant perennials that we're hoping to be harvesting from for the next 5, 10 more years. Looking forward to sort of the trends of our weather patterns, the heat of our summers, the depths of our drought, being mindful of those things and planning towards that future is something that is wise. Biggest thing for us is sort of a warming pattern that we're seeing. We have typically over the last 15 years on average, we've lost about 1 day below freezing every 2 to 3 years. And we've also been gaining a day above 95 every year. As that trend continues, and trends can always change with any number of factors that are hard to predict. But with those, we could very quickly see frost dates become a little bit less predictable. Storm severity is unpredictable. But the biggest thing is if we have longer, hotter summers and our winters, if our temperatures sort of bleed further in to October or earlier into March, that can affect when we want to plant things, the types of things that will do well in extended heat, or that are going to be able to produce in time when planting in the fall. But it also sort of doubles down on incentives for good practices anyway. If we're expecting more severe storms, having those areas where we allow water to effectively and cleanly move around our garden spaces and not like create standing pools, or if we have expectations of more periods of drought and extreme heat in the future, giving thought towards opportunities for capturing some of that excess water in times where we have heavy rainfall in catch barrels or whatever else that we might be able to use later. Those are definitely things worth considering when either planning a new garden or planning on how to improve the garden you already have. And then sort of putting a bow on all of that, covered a lot of different information. There's a lot to think of in a whole half of the season when gardening. But if all of that is either information you already have, or if it's something you're going to have to process or take piece by piece, the real key information that I hope you can take away is really just making sure that your crops have the space that they need, that they're well fed, and that you give them the time period they need so that they can do what they do naturally. And in that same space, make sure that you have that time so that you can invest in your garden in a way that's going to help it be successful. And just reiterating what I said before, it can be counterintuitive, but the best way to improve your production is to start by growing a little bit less and figuring out how to do that really well. If your garden is clean, well weeded, well pruned, your attention to signs of disease, that's going to make such a big difference in the health as well as the production of that space. And you're going to feel a whole lot better, not just being in the garden, but being able to enjoy those fruits that are coming. And that's the bulk of what I'd like to say this evening. Happy to take questions.
Okay, we have some actually. So the first question we had was, when is a good time to remove the summer crops that are still, if they are still producing, to fall crops? Use the same space.
You've got to use the same space. Part of it is a decision on what you would like to grow for the fall. If you really want those long season crops, if you really want a pumpkin or you really want a cabbage or broccoli, you're gonna have to make a decision. But sometimes it's easy, especially when we're dealing with summer cucurbits. So that's your melons, that's your squashes, that's your cucumbers. Most of those, by the time you get to July or early August, they're starting to look a little ragged. You're typically looking at pressure from squash beetles, from borers, downy and powdery mildew. It's just a tough time to grow those crops. And so you may still be getting flowers, you may still be getting fruits, but you're almost certainly noticing a significant drop off in those things. And with that, I would say typically sort of cut your losses on those, begin investing in the future of your farm, or the future of your garden into the fall, and invest those things towards your compost for next spring. For those growing heirloom tomatoes, or especially like your hot varieties of peppers that may really just be coming on this time of the year, if those are the things that you're really looking forward to and the fall is just sort of a bonus part of your season, hold on to those for right now and look more towards your shorter season crops that you can plant closer to middle to end of September. So your Asian greens like bok choy, arugula, your lettuces, your certain varieties of like leafy kale, salad radishes. There's plenty of things you can get in to the last 6 to 7 weeks of the season, and you don't necessarily have to rush away from the crops that you've waited this long and they're really now just getting started.
Okay. What about onions? When should we plant onions?
So onions fall into that same category with garlic, where if you want to grow them as a fall crop, which is typically the best way to do it, and overwinter them in this region, usually you're looking at the last week of September through maybe the middle of October being your ideal time to get bulbs, so like started bulbs into the ground. If you're growing them from seed, I typically recommend looking a little bit earlier, so you're allowing that plant to get a little bit more mature in size, so they're not so young when they go dormant and have to survive through the winter. So by bulb, I would recommend last week of September through middle of October. By seed, you're probably looking at the first week or two of September.
And the idea there is that you just mentioned it, but the reality is they're going to go dormant over the winter, and then they're going to come back around and look like a plant again because
That's
you think
correct.
you've killed them. I thought I
It can
had.
feel that way. And I definitely still recommend the mulching because it would be terrible to be that excited and invested in it and just lose it because of a couple cold nights.
True, true. And mulch is easy enough to find. I mean, leaves are on the side of the road. You can get them everywhere.
Mhm.
Not that this is going to be a problem for fall gardens, I suppose, but Brandon asked about Japanese beetle solutions. Do you have any ideas about how to get rid of the old Japanese beetle?
I mean, it's one of those things where there's a dozen solutions out there that you ask 10 farmers and they'll give you 10 different answers kind of
Mhm.
things. We have had success with the Japanese beetle traps, just the over-the-counter Japanese beetle bag traps. Uh, One sort of like instructions that they give on the bags that a lot of people just sort of like bypass is the goal is to set those outside of your growing space. You're trying to attract the beetles away from your crops. So most every one of those is going to tell you to put it at least 100 feet away from your growing area, and you're trying to get them to go over there rather than to your crop. Now, not every gardener has 100 feet of space to just go throw their beetle trap over there. Um, we we do use a couple of organic certified products at the farm. One of our most successful general purpose insect solutions is a product called Time Guard. Thyme as in the herb. It's a As a product, all it is thyme essential oil, a little bit of biodegradable soap, and a little bit of isopropyl alcohol, and like 95% water. Uh, what those three things do in combination is they form a coat on the leaf that is relatively water resistant. So after about an hour, it'll last through rains for a couple days typically, and it makes it one not taste very good for any of your potential predator insects. If they do eat it, it essentially gives them indigestion. Like it's the oils and the soap, they just don't. It doesn't sit with us, so they go to find something else. But importantly, you try not to spray it into your flowers, or really, we try to avoid any of our flowering crops. But because it's on the leaf surface rather than and it works by when a insect ingests it. It's not the same as like say like a seven dust or something similar where it's a contact killer and you could be affecting a lot of your native and like honeybee pollinators. It's a little more selective in the things that it's going after. And it's not a bulletproof solution, and there are other products like it out there, but we found some good success with that, and it may be a good benefit for you.
Well, and I have a much smaller space than you have to deal with, and I literally take a wine bottle after I've cleaned that out, and put some soapy water in the bottom of it, and I just pop them in there. And if you do it long enough, you will eventually lower the population. Now, again, that only works in a small area, but it was one of my favorite pastimes earlier in the summer.
Mhm.
Um, What is, you mentioned some varieties to not use because they take too long to come to fruition, literally. But what are some of the better varieties that you've had success with that, you know, for a home gardener, for lettuce particularly and cabbage? And I'm thinking at least, is lettuce better that it's head lettuce or leaf lettuce for the fall around here?
So lettuce, both are very successful in this
Okay.
region. Now, your head lettuce is typically a little bit more cold hardy, and that's not a universal rule, but they call it iceberg lettuce for a reason. So your really solid lettuce choices for this region. You could look at all different types of bib lettuce. So Boston Head or Salanova or oak leaf are a really good option. Um, if you wanted those nice like crisp leaves that you get with romaine and iceberg, uh, there are good varieties of romaine that do well in the cold. Romaine specialty typically, as well as summer crisp lettuce, is being able to grow well in hot weather and without bolting. So typically those are a great spring crop because you can get them in and you can grow them into the warmer. Now we're in sort of the warm to cool to do better in so uh, there are a handful, but it's a for that's a great. It's um, we grow a variety called Fareo. That's Farao, uh, and it's a great mid-season cabbage. Get you a nice 4 to 5 pound head. You know, something in like this range, but it's only going to take about 75 to 80 days. Whereas most of your larger storage varieties, so your typhoons, your late flat Dutches, those are going to be pushing 110 days, and they'll get you a nice 7, 8, sometimes bigger pound head. But what ends up happening is we stretch our daylight so far that they're never really going to be able to reach that potential, and they won't be able to form enough leaves to have that nice core as well as plenty of wrapper leaves, which are what most people are going after, is those nice dense wrapper leaves on the outside. Um, One additional recommendation that's neither of those, but we've worked with a broccoli variety for the last 2 years that we've been very happy with called Emerald Crown. Uh, it's a variety that because broccoli, there's a lot of varieties that have an issue with once they get hit by a cold night, especially if it's a frost or even if there's like a snow, they get what's called purpling on the dome. And some of those flower buds will turn sort of a dull brownish purple color. They'll get soft. They get bitter. It's just you can lose a beautiful broccoli head like that. But there are a handful of varieties that handle that very well. When we grew them the first time, due to some issues with what we were able to take care of in the fall, I just sort of left about 2 dozen of them neglected at the side of our field and just let them go. When I came back to do some checking in the second week of December, we had beautiful big green heads that were completely healthy that had gone through probably a dozen nights at 20 degrees or below. And my biggest head was over 4 pounds.
Wow.
Very strong growth habit, big, thick vine, or big, thick stem that's not too woody. For anyone looking, especially to try season extension, and really sort of take the maximum opportunity to grow into the November and early December months, definitely recommend Emerald Crown broccoli.
Excellent. Well, that wasn't on my list, but that's wonderful. Because broccoli's awesome.
Mhm.
One other question: what are there any varieties of lime trees that can weather the winter here? So I assume, Laura, you mean outside. Because you can always, you know, put them in a pot and drag them back and forth. That sometimes works.
Right. Lime
Yes,
trees,
outside.
most of your citruses are going to have a hard time in this region as an outside plant. There are a handful of like true dwarf varieties that can be potted. I believe there is a Meyer lime, similar to the Meyer lemon,
I think you're right.
that really only top out about 5 or 6 feet. You get that a nice pot and you allow it to go dormant during the winter and then come back and bring it outside. You can have excellent limes. If you have several of them and you're not someone that uses them all the time, you could have as many fresh limes as you need. But I think I'd be doing you a disservice by saying that, you know, with enough will and dreams, you can just kind of plant a plant that really belongs like 4 or 5 growing zones away from us and really have a high chance of success here.
Agreed. Yeah. I mean, Laura, you can build a greenhouse there. That's a cheap way to get a lime.
It's true. Well, cheap being the relevant term there.
Yeah. The limes would have to be very expensive to make that pan out. We'll take this as our last question. What is the best time to plant artichoke, if it's even successful here? Because it's a perennial, right?
Yes, so artichokes can be grown here. I know a handful of people that do that. It's not something that we have grown, but from my understanding, that is a crop that's not typically started in the fall. That's one that you'll start in the spring and allow it to really get established. My understanding is that it's similar to asparagus in that really the first season or two is establishing that strong root system from which you're going to be producing your fruiting heads that you're actually going to be harvesting. I would treat that in a similar vein to how we talked about our other perennials, where the main part of what you're trying to do in the fall is mostly mulching. And if you have any like diseased or damaged growth, taking that opportunity when the plant is dormant to remove that and help improve your plant's health going into the spring. But planting time, I want to say May, like early May is when my other farming colleague typically is looking at his artichokes.
Okay. Yeah, they're a beautiful plant. I just have never seen anybody grow them around here, but it's worth a shot, right? And
Sure.
yeah. I don't know where you get the start for it, but well, I really appreciate it. We all really appreciate it. You've got lots of thank yous on the chat line too. And so thank you, Todd, very much. For anybody that wants a copy of his presentation, just shoot me an email and I will make sure that you get that. I'm at Casey at Christine. I'll put it on here. And otherwise, I will actually, I'll probably post it on the Master Gardener website anyway. So when I post the, oh yeah, because we didn't get to your resources. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine.
I posted all of these resources in the chat box, the links to all of those YouTube channels, and to the Roots Farm Facebook page and the website. So all of that is in the chat box, and I think all of you guys were here from the beginning, so it should be at the very beginning there. And again, if you have any trouble with that, just shoot me an email and I'll get it to you. And I'll have all of this posted on the Master Gardener website, so you can watch this again. And I'll just go ahead and post this presentation too, so you can get the live links there. So thank you all for coming out, and thank you, Todd, for helping us get motivated to get started to do round 2.
Thank you.
Thank you. Of course.
Good night, guys.